All right, good morning, everybody. It's let's see, what is today? Thursday. This is a supplement to the lecture delivered Tuesday morning, the very first day of lecture. I thought we could just carry this over till Thursday, but in fact, there is material from Chapter 4 already slated to be delivered on Thursday. So there's just a few slides left here. This is, again, basically Lecture 1, Part 2. Later today, you'll see Lecture 2 posted. But we talked about the unit of evolution, the species. We talked about some examples, how species are born in terms of being described by people. And next question here really is, what is a species? Okay, we talked about, how they're named, different language used to name them, these root words used in the naming process. Should definitely know these Latin or Greek roots. Okay, but there are three different ways to define a species, because it turns out to be surprisingly difficult to actually define what a species is. If I ask people to give me 10 examples of species, most people can do that. Other folks can give you probably 1,000 species. But how do you what makes a species different from each other? In some ways it's simple, and in other ways it's much more complex. Okay, and we'll talk about some of that complexity, but I'm going to give you three, they're called concepts for defining species. The first and the most commonly used species concept is the biological species concept. Okay, and that says that this group of organisms is a different species from another group if they interbreed within themselves, but don't interbreed with other such groups. Okay, so this is a group of animals that can potentially or actually does interbreed and produces fertile offspring. Okay, so this in the Endangered Species Act uses this concept most, again, it's the most common. So some advantages of this. Number one is just it is objective. Okay, we're going to talk about subjective, which means it is subjected to people's opinion. There's not necessarily an exactly correct answer. Depends on who you ask, type of thing. Objective means that there's clearly a yes or no answer, and that's usually what we're after in sciences. So two groups objectively either can interbreed with each other or they can't. Okay, they can either, a male and a female can bring their gametes together, and fertilization will happen, and that will develop into a similar individual that is capable of procreating itself, or not. Okay, so that is an advantage. Some of the disadvantages are, how do you apply this concept to extinct species? How do you apply this concept to asexual species, such as all the different archaeans and bacteria? And then finally, okay, so how do you observe this? If one population of white-tailed deers lives in Alaska and another one lives in Costa Rica, how do you know if they could interbreed, right? So you have to bring those organisms together and then try to coax them into reproducing, which is very difficult to do. So it's difficult to observe this. Now you can see the evidence for interbreeding based on whether or not they share genetics. Okay, so that's the biological species concept. Okay, the second concept. Okay, second species concept is called the morphological species concept, which basically, morphology, we always think of morph as change, but it's more of like, what is it? It's a change in shape. So the morphological species concept, in the simplest way, is to say that two groups of organisms are the same species if they have the same shape, the same morphology. But it goes beyond that, because really anything that is phenotypically related, based, if that differs consistently within a group of organisms compared to another group of organisms, that can be used to define a morphological species. Okay, so it could be internal morphology, it could be bone structure, it could be you know, soft tissue type things. Anything that is phenotypic, right, can be part of this morphological species concept. So some advantages: it's really a fairly intuitive and simple to understand concept, and simplicity is good. In many cases, this concept can be applied by people who don't have expensive equipment, and that again is good too. But some disadvantage. Oh, and another advantage is this can be applied to extinct species, and so this is how we have defined and continue to define species of dinosaurs or fossil organisms, is looking at their shape or phenotype. Some disadvantages: this is a very subjective type of concept, in that somebody asked the other day in class, how different do you need to be different, right? And so this is a constant battle in the application of the morphological species concept, right? Because we know within a population, just like we saw with the Knoll lab, there are variations, right? We can clearly see that in the human population. So it's more of the variation within a species is less than the variation between that group and another such group of other organisms from a different species. So that is the big disadvantage of the morphological species concept. And then the third, and this is becoming a very increasingly popular species concept, which is that it's similar to the evolutionary species concept, but this is the phylogenetic species concept. And it says that the small set of organisms that share a common ancestor and are distinguishable from other sets, that is what makes a group of organisms a different species. So if this group shares a common ancestor that is not shared with other groups, and that they can be distinguished really genetically or genomically from other set groups.
These days, it can be easy to lose track of things.
Did I feed you?
But taking prescriptions shouldn't be one of them. CVS Simple Dose pre-sorts your prescriptions into packets, so you know what to take when.
Okay, well, I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so some advantages. This is directly reflective of evolution. Okay, and so we are really working towards our discussion of evolution, but species need to be evolutionarily more related to each other than they are to other groups. They need to be on a similar evolutionary trajectory, and so this species concept is really directly related to that. And so that is one of the good things about it. It can be applied to extinct species too, right? And so that actually brings me to that stupid Scientific American thing that keeps playing ads here. I don't know if you guys watched the Game of Thrones series. In there were these large wolves, dire wolves. It's really popular in many different movies and stories and things. But the dire wolf was a fossil species, a big wolf, lived in North America. It was assumed that this was just a offshoot of the gray wolf, so maybe a specialized subspecies of gray wolf, Canis lupus. But paleo scientists were able to lift DNA from wolves and actually sequence a genome of 5 different dire wolves, and they use that to build a phylogenetic tree and to look and see the relatedness of this extinct species to the extant or living gray wolf. And it looks like dire wolf were not wolves at all, right? So these, here's the I don't know which is which in here, but let's see, a pack of dire wolves are feeding. Okay, so the dire wolves will be these larger ones. Here's the gray wolves, and they look similar. So the assumption was they were closely related, but this new research indicates that dire wolves are a totally separate evolutionary branch of the mammal tree, and that they convergently look similar because they had similar lifestyle, similar niches. So that's pretty interesting, and not necessarily an application. Well, actually, the application of the morphological species concept really indicated that these two were closely related, maybe even the same species. But now looking at the phylogenetic species concept, we realize that they are not closely related at all, right? Some disadvantages of this phylogenetic species concept. Number one, we get back into the subjectivity, okay, because every individual except identical twins are genetically different, so they will be a different branch on the end of the tree. So how far back on the tree do you need to go before you're a different species? How genetically dissimilar do you need to be? And then the other disadvantage is just the amount of training and equipment that's needed to apply this concept. And to me, that's a problem because we still have millions of species to be described, and we can't afford to just have people at large universities with $1 million budgets to be able to describe those species. So other part of systematics is this idea of classification. So taxonomy is actually naming the species, but then classification is putting them into groups. So dire wolf, it's what group is it, or what, the name of it is a dire wolf, and it has a scientific name. But then the classification aspect is to say, okay, well, are they in this subfamily that includes, or maybe even in genus, Canis, that includes coyotes and wolves and domestic dogs, or should they be classified in which I guess is probably going to happen, they'll be reclassified into a different genus, because we realize that they are not that closely related to each other. Okay, so just similar to these Russian dolls, we have big groupings that are very inclusive. So you are in the same domain if you have a nucleus, right? And then we drop down into kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And as we go lower and lower, you have to have very specific characteristics in order to be included in the same genus, perhaps, or the same species. And the assumption here is that these organisms share a characteristic because they are genetically related to each other, closely related to each other. So the assumption with the dire wolf was they have the same shaped skulls, they have the same skeletal similarities because they're closely related to each other. But we're now seeing that this is not always the case. And we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. Okay, so here's the example of the northern pine snake. Okay, so it's in the eukaryote because it has a membrane-bound organelles. It's an animal because it develops in a predictable manner. It doesn't have a cell wall, other cellular characteristics. It's a chordate because it has a notochord and a postanal tail, and et cetera, all the way down. Now, to be in the same subspecies, you have to have very specific characteristics in common, because there's a bunch of colubrid snakes, and they share some characteristics, but not as specific as members of Pituophis melanolepis. Okay. So the way that this happens, the way that we group or categorize or classify organisms, follows a couple of rules, right? One is that classification must reflect the evolutionary history. Okay, so again, animals within a given family are all more closely related to other members of that family than they are to members of another family. Okay, and so this is a very important rule, and we'll see has caused a lot of grief or a lot of excitement in zoology and botany and so on. And that classification is not a static thing. It's very dynamic and changing all the time. I'll touch back on that dire wolf story because I'm curious to see if the classification has changed. So this is not always obvious. And when we see a lot of changes in taxonomy, it's not necessarily because we're totally discovering new species, but our understanding of evolutionary relatedness changes, and so therefore the classification changes. Okay. So an example here of the application of this, we looked at these organisms in lab this week, the members of the genus Anolis. Okay, and lots of diversity in the group, very species-rich group. And the question comes up, how do we make sense of this diversity? Sometimes members of a genus are put into, there's a classification called tribe between a genus and the species. So you could be in the genus Plethodon, but in a tribe Plethodontinae or something like that. And so how do you make sense of these? And so in the first module, we looked at the shape of these lizards, right? We looked at the relative hind limb length. That is how long the hind limb is compared to how big the organism is. And then same thing with relative tail length. And based on the plot of those two, we see groupings occur. These two sort of out here by themselves, these two up here by themselves. These two groups here are more separated by hind limb rather than tail length. Right? And the interesting thing is that these groupings are also not only morphologically related, but also related to the ecology of the groups. So that these two, Anolis sheplini and Anolis occultus, have this unique shape. And what is that? That they have a relatively low hind limb length and a relatively short tail length too. So they have short tails and short limbs. This group has relatively long tails and relatively long hind limbs. And that these guys are usually found on twigs, and these guys are usually found on the ground in grasses and bushes. Okay, so it may be tempting to say, okay, well, we're going to put these guys into a group taxonomically, and these guys in a group, and these guys in a group, right? That this is how we should group them. But you will see, as you saw in Module 2, that is not related to their evolutionary relatedness. Okay, but we're going to get there. But why is this logical? Okay, you would think that if these guys are similar shape, that they should be similarly related. That if they are similar shape, that they'd be more related to each other than they would be to these two species. Here's some example from the human species. Why would you assume that, right? Look at these three gentlemen here. It's just remarkable, their similarities in their morphology, and they are all siblings. Here's a father and son and a mother and a son, right? It's a safe assumption that if you look very similar to each other, you're probably related. Why? Because genetics and shape are closely related. Okay, so we now actually understand, here's these different measures of a human face. This length here is the nose height. This area here is the forehead area. And here are some genes that are related to the shape of the human face. So why does this little boy look a lot like this man, because the genes that determine the shape of his face, the inter-nares distance, the nose height, how wide his chin is, whether you have a dimple, those genes that determine that characteristic of him were inherited directly from his father. And so you would assume that organisms that are related to each other would share a similar shape, okay? And oftentimes that is a good assumption, but sometimes not. And we're going to talk about that, why that is. It's, again, this is the same story as the direwolf. Why was the direwolf assumed to be the same group as gray wolves? Because they look very similar, okay? And so the more interesting thing to me is, how could it be that two anoles look very similar but are not close related? Could it be that the direwolf and the gray wolf look very, very similar, but they are actually not that closely related? And so that's what we're going to talk about in the forthcoming lectures.